There is a place where human memory begins to fade into something older, something that whispers from beneath the sand, encoded in clay tablets and buried temples, a land where the first cities rose from nothing, where writing itself was born, and where gods walked among men, or so the stories tell us. We call it Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, but what we call it matters less than what it was, what it became, and what it left behind. Most of us learn about ancient civilizations in passing, Egypt with its pyramids, Greece with its philosophers, Rome with its empire, but there is something older than all of these, something that predates them by thousands of years, and in the ruins of that world lies a question that archaeologists and historians have never fully answered. How did civilization begin so suddenly, so completely, in a place that should have been desert? The Tigris and Euphrates rivers flow through what we now call Iraq. Between them, in the southern plains, the Sumerians appeared around 4000 BCE, not as primitive hunter-gatherers slowly learning to farm, but as a people who already knew, who built cities, who developed writing, who created law codes, astronomical charts, and complex irrigation systems almost overnight in historical terms. Some researchers have suggested that the emergence of Sumerian civilization was gradual, that it evolved naturally from earlier settlements. But the archaeological record shows something stranger. The Ubaid culture that preceded the Sumerians left behind simple pottery and modest villages. Then, within a few centuries, massive temple complexes were rising in Uruk. Cylinder seals bearing intricate designs were being used to mark property and contracts. Cuneiform script was recording not just grain stores, but epic poetry. It's as if someone flipped a switch. The ancient Mesopotamians themselves had an explanation. They said their knowledge came from the Apkallu, 7 sages who emerged from the sea before the Great Flood. These beings, neither fully human nor fully divine, taught humanity the arts of civilization, architecture, mathematics, writing, kingship. The Sumerians didn't claim to have invented these things. They claimed to have been taught them. Modern scholars dismiss this as myth. But myths are not random. They're memories, distorted by time, wrapped in symbol and metaphor. And when you look closely at Mesopotamian civilization, you find patterns that don't fit the standard narrative of slow human progress. Consider Uruk, the world's first true city. By 3200 BCE, it covered nearly 6 square kilometers and housed somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 people. The city was dominated by the Anu Ziggurat and the temple complex of Inanna, dedicated to the goddess Inanna. These weren't crude structures. The White Temple of Anu stood on an artificial mountain of sun-dried brick, accessed by monumental staircases. The walls were decorated with cone mosaics, thousands of clay cones with coloured heads pressed into the mud brick to create geometric patterns. This level of organisation requires more than just farmers deciding to live together. It requires urban planning, administrative systems, a priesthood capable of coordinating massive construction projects. And most importantly, it requires writing. The earliest cuneiform tablets from Uruk are not primitive scratches. They're sophisticated enough to record complex transactions, temple inventories and administrative details. The script itself appears almost fully formed. Earlier pictographic symbols existed, yes, but the leap to cuneiform, a phonetic writing system capable of representing abstract ideas, happened remarkably fast. Why did they need writing? The standard answer is economic. Temples and palaces needed to track grain stores, livestock and trade goods. But this only raises another question. Why did they have temples and palaces in the first place? Why did human beings who had lived in small egalitarian bands for hundreds of thousands of years suddenly accept hierarchy, taxation, and centralized authority. Some archaeologists point to the hydraulic hypothesis, the idea that irrigation agriculture in Mesopotamia required such coordination, that centralized states naturally emerged to manage water resources. But other river valley civilizations didn't follow this pattern. The Nile flooded predictably and required less infrastructure. The Indus Valley developed extensive urban planning, but minimal evidence of strong centralized authority. Mesopotamia was different. The cities that rose between the Tigris and Euphrates were built on something more than efficient farming. They were built on belief, on a cosmology that placed human beings in a specific relationship with divine forces. The temple wasn't just a building, it was the literal house of the god. The ziggurat wasn't just a monument, it was a mountain, the meeting place of heaven and earth. And the king? The king was something in between. The Sumerian word for kingship is Namlugal, literally the state of being a great man. But kingship in Mesopotamia wasn't just political power. It was sacred authority, lowered from heaven. The ancient texts say that after the flood, kingship descended again from the sky. Before that, kings ruled for impossibly long reigns, thousands of years, according to the Sumerian king list. Modern scholars interpret these long reigns as mythological. But what if they're not meant to be chronological? What if they're describing something else? A period when time itself was measured differently, or when the concept of kingship existed in a form we no longer understand? The deeper you go into Mesopotamian history, the stranger it becomes. Take the sexagesimal system, the base 60 mathematics developed by the Sumerians. We still use it today. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. Why 60? Why not 10 like most human counting systems? Based on fingers? The Babylonians, who inherited Sumerian mathematics, could perform calculations that wouldn't be matched in Europe until the Renaissance. They solved quadratic equations. They understood the Pythagorean theorem more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras. Their astronomical observations were so precise that they could predict lunar eclipses. This wasn't primitive science. This was a mature intellectual tradition, already ancient by the time Hammurabi carved his law code in 1750 BCE. And that law code itself, the Code of Hammurabi, is another mystery wrapped in plain sight. It's often called the world's oldest written law, but it isn't. The laws of Ur-Nammu predate it by 3 centuries. The laws of Lipit Ishtar came even earlier. What Hammurabi did was consolidate and formalize a legal tradition that had been evolving for over 1,000 years. The code covers everything from property disputes to medical malpractice. It establishes different penalties based on social class. It regulates trade, marriage, inheritance, and slavery. It even sets prices for various services, how much a surgeon should charge, how much a boat rental should cost. This is not the law code of a primitive society. This is the legal framework of a complex civilization that had been dealing with urban problems for millennia. But here's what's strange. These laws assume that everyone involved already understands the basic concept of written legal authority. They assume literacy, record-keeping, contracts enforced by temple and palace bureaucracies. Where did this infrastructure come from? The Mesopotamians themselves said it came from before the flood, from the time of the Apkallu, from the age when the gods lived in the cities of men and taught them the secrets of civilization. And then something happened. The texts are clear about this. There was a catastrophe, a deluge, a breaking of the world. The Epic of Gilgamesh tells the story. So does the older Sumerian tale of Ziusudra. And later, the Hebrew Bible would retell the same story as Noah's flood. But in the Mesopotamian version, the flood wasn't sent because humanity was wicked. It was sent because humanity was too loud, too numerous. The gods couldn't sleep. So they decided to wipe the earth clean and start over. One man was warned, Utnapishtim in the Babylonian version, Ziusudra in Sumerian, Atrahasis in another text. He built a boat, saved his family and the animals, and when the waters receded, the gods granted him immortality. He became the first of the wise ones, the keeper of pre-flood knowledge. Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, who lived sometime around 2700 BCE, sought out Utnapishtim to learn the secret of eternal life. The epic tells us that Gilgamesh failed. He learned that immortality belongs only to the gods and those few humans they choose to elevate. But he also learned something else, that what survives death is not the body, but the name, the story, the memory carved in stone. This is why Gilgamesh built the walls of Uruk, why he wanted his deeds recorded. He understood something fundamental, that civilization is memory made solid. But what if there was an earlier civilization, one that existed before the flood, one whose memory was preserved not in its own ruins, but in the sudden inexplicable sophistication of what came after? The archaeological evidence doesn't give us a clear answer, but it gives us hints. The Ubaid period, which preceded the rise of Sumerian cities, shows evidence of long-distance trade networks. Ubaid pottery has been found as far away as the Persian Gulf coast. This suggests organised maritime activity long before cities existed. It suggests that the economic and social networks that would later support urban civilization were already forming. And then there are the temple platforms. Even in the earliest Ubaid settlements, we find temple structures built on raised platforms, simple at first, but growing more elaborate over time, as if the builders were following a template, a memory of something grander. Some researchers have suggested that the tradition of ziggurat construction, building artificial sacred mountains, reflects a memory of mountains themselves, that the Sumerians, or their ancestors, came from a mountainous region and brought with them the religious practice of worshipping on high places. But this only pushes the question back further. Where did they come from? And why did they come to the flat, flood-prone plains of southern Mesopotamia? The texts say they came from Dilmun, a paradise in the east, a place where there was no sickness, no death, no sorrow, a place that was pure. But Dilmun was also a real place, what we now call Bahrain, in the Persian Gulf, and the Persian Gulf itself has a secret. At the end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago, sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than they are today. The Persian Gulf didn't exist. What is now underwater was a vast river valley, fed by the Tigris, Euphrates and other rivers, a fertile, well-watered paradise. And then the ice melted. The seas rose, and that paradise drowned beneath the waves. Could the memory of that drowning be what the Mesopotamians preserved in their flood myths? Could the sudden rise of Sumerian civilization be the result of refugees from that drowned world, bringing with them knowledge preserved from an earlier age? We have no proof, but we have the cities, the writing, the mathematics, the astronomy, the law codes, the myths. And we have one more thing. In 539 BCE, long after the glory of Sumer had faded into memory, the last native Mesopotamian empire fell. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, which had rebuilt Babylon into a wonder of the ancient world, was conquered by Cyrus the Great of Persia. But even in conquests, something strange happened. Cyrus didn't destroy Babylon, he honoured it. He presented himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as the legitimate heir to Mesopotamian kingship. The Cyrus cylinder, discovered in the 19th century, records his claims in Akkadian, the language of Babylon. He restored temples, he returned captured gods to their cities, He freed the exiled peoples who had been brought to Babylon by previous conquests, including the Jews who had been living in Babylon since Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem in 586 BCE. Why would a Persian king go to such lengths to preserve Babylonian tradition? Because even then, in the 6th century BCE, Babylon represented something more than political power. It represented continuity, a connection to the deep past, to the time when the gods walked among men and taught them the secrets of civilization. Cyrus understood that to rule Mesopotamia, you had to become part of its story. You had to be written into the long memory that stretched back through Babylon, through Assyria, through Akkad, through Ur, all the way to Uruk and the first cities. And that memory was kept alive in the most practical way imaginable, in the scribal schools where young men learned to read and write cuneiform, not just for accounting, but for literature, for history, for the preservation of epic poems like Gilgamesh, hymns to the gods, and king lists that traced lineages back thousands of years. The scribes of Babylon were the keepers of memory, and they knew something we've forgotten. They knew that civilization is fragile, that it can collapse, that knowledge can be lost. But they also knew that if you write it down, if you carve it in clay and bake it in fire, it can survive, it can wait in the ground for thousands of years until someone digs it up and remembers. This is what Mesopotamia teaches us. Not that the past is dead, but that it's sleeping, waiting to be read, waiting to be understood, and perhaps waiting to be remembered for what it truly was. When Alexander the Great entered Babylon in 331 BCE, he wept, not from sorrow, but from a strange mixture of awe and frustration. Here was the young Macedonian conqueror who had defeated the greatest empire the world had ever known, standing before a city that had been ancient when his own civilization was born. The walls of Babylon stretched so far that chariots could race along their tops. The Ishtar Gate gleamed with blue-glazed bricks and golden bulls. The ziggurat of Itemenanki, the Tower of Babel itself, rose in 7 stages toward the sky. But Alexander saw something else. He saw decay. The great ziggurat was crumbling. Parts of the city lay in ruins. The priests who greeted him were custodians of a tradition they could barely maintain. The glory that had been Babylon was fading, even as its reputation remained immortal. Alexander wanted to restore it. He ordered his engineers to begin clearing the rubble from Itemenanki, intending to rebuild the tower to its former height. But the task was too great. The structure had been damaged by Xerxes' armies over a century before, and decades of neglect had taken their toll. Alexander's men worked for months, clearing away debris, but the king died in Babylon before the work could truly begin. He died in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, the same king who had built the Hanging Gardens and rebuilt Babylon into perhaps the most magnificent city the ancient world had ever seen. Alexander died at 32, his empire unfinished, his dreams of merging East and West still unrealized. But something about Babylon had captured him. Something about its age, its depth, its connection to a past that stretched back beyond memory. What was it about this place that could move even a conqueror to tears? The answer lies not in the ruins themselves, but in what they represented. Babylon wasn't just old, it was a bridge, a connection between the human present and something far more ancient, something that had been deliberately preserved through thousands of years of war, conquest, and cultural transformation. After Alexander's death, his empire was carved up by his generals. Seleucus took control of Mesopotamia and founded the Seleucid Empire. The culture became Hellenistic, Greek language, Greek philosophy, Greek architecture mixed with Babylonian traditions. A new capital was built at Seleucia on the Tigris River, drawing population away from ancient Babylon. But even as people left, the scribes remained. the temples continued to function, and in their libraries something extraordinary was being preserved. Cuneiform tablets from the Seleucid period show that Babylonian priests were still recording astronomical observations, still copying ancient literary texts, still maintaining the intellectual traditions that had begun 3,000 years earlier. They were creating astronomical diaries, detailed records of planetary positions, lunar eclipses, and celestial phenomena. These observations were so precise that modern astronomers have used them to calculate ancient eclipse dates and planetary movements with remarkable accuracy. Think about that for a moment. In an age when Babylon was in decline, when Greek was becoming the language of power and commerce, Babylonian priests were still looking at the sky and recording what they saw, still maintaining observational records that stretched back centuries, still passing down knowledge that had been accumulating since the time of the Sumerians. Why? What drove them to preserve this knowledge even as their world was changing around them? The answer, recorded in their own texts, is simple but profound. They believed they were custodians of sacred knowledge, knowledge that had been given to humanity by the gods through the Apkallu in the time before the flood. It was their duty to maintain it, even if no one else understood its importance. And they did maintain it, through the Seleucid period, through the Parthian conquest in the 2nd century BCE, through the rise of the Sasanian Persian Empire in the 3rd century CE, even through the early Islamic period, when Arabic began to replace Aramaic as the lingua franca of the region. The memory of Mesopotamia's ancient knowledge persisted. The last known cuneiform tablet dates to 75 CE. After that, the script finally died. 3,000 years of continuous writing tradition came to an end. The knowledge encoded in thousands of clay tablets was no longer readable to the living. It became archaeology. But before it died, something important happened. The knowledge didn't disappear, it transformed. The astronomical tables compiled by Babylonian priests were translated into Greek. Greek astronomers like Hipparchus and Ptolemy built on Babylonian observations, creating models of planetary motion that would dominate Western astronomy until the Renaissance. The sexagesimal system, based 60 mathematics, passed into Greek and then Arabic science, eventually becoming the foundation of modern timekeeping and geometry. Even more remarkably, Babylonian mythology and cosmology influenced Jewish theology during the Babylonian exile. When the Jews were brought to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BCE, they spent nearly 50 years in a civilization far older and more sophisticated than their own. They saw the great temples, they heard the creation myths, they learned from Babylonian scribes, and when they returned to Jerusalem, they brought those influences with them. The creation story in Genesis, the 7 days, the separation of waters, the garden in the east, echoes Babylonian cosmology. The flood narrative is almost identical to the Epic of Gilgamesh. Even the concept of the Sabbath, the 7-day week, reflects Babylonian religious observances. This isn't to say the Hebrew Bible is simply copied from Babylonian sources. It's transformed, reinterpreted through monotheistic theology. But the connection is undeniable. The deep past of Mesopotamia became part of the foundation of Western religion, often without people realizing the source. The same thing happened with law. Hammurabi's code and the earlier Mesopotamian legal traditions influenced Greek and Roman. Legal thinking. The concept of written law, publicly displayed so that all citizens could know their rights and obligations, became fundamental to Western civilization. We take it for granted now, but it began in Mesopotamia. And perhaps most importantly, the idea of history itself, the notion that the past should be recorded, preserved, and studied, originated in the scribal schools of Mesopotamia. The Sumerian king list, which attempted to document every ruler from the time kingship descended from heaven to the present, was an early form of historical chronicle. The Babylonian chronicles continued this tradition, recording major events year by year. This is what survived the fall of Mesopotamian civilization. Not the cities, not the empires, but the ideas, the knowledge, the intellectual framework that made civilization possible in the first place. When Baghdad was founded by the Abbasid Caliphate in 762 CE, just a few miles from the ruins of ancient Babylon, it became the center of the Islamic Golden Age. The House of Wisdom, established in the 9th century, collected texts from across the known world, Greek, Persian, Indian, and yes, remnants of Babylonian knowledge preserved in various forms. Scholars translated these works into Arabic, creating a synthesis of knowledge that would later be transmitted to medieval Europe during the Renaissance. The cycle continued, knowledge preserved, transformed, passed forward. But here's what haunts researchers who study this period: how much was lost. We know that the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh contained over 30,000 tablets, including copies of texts from Sumerian times. When Nineveh fell in 612 BCE, the library was destroyed by fire. Ironically, the fire baked the clay tablets, preserving them. Without that accidental preservation, we would know almost nothing about Mesopotamian literature. How many other libraries existed? How many texts were copied on papyrus or leather instead of clay and simply rotted away? How much knowledge was passed down orally in the priesthoods and died with the last generation of priests who understood it? We'll never know, but we can make educated guesses based on what the texts themselves tell us. The Babylonian priests claimed to have astronomical records going back thousands of years. Greek historians like Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in the 3rd century BCE, said that Babylonian astronomical observations extended back 490,000 years before Alexander. This number is obviously exaggerated, but it suggests that the Babylonians themselves believed their observational tradition was extraordinarily ancient. Modern analysis of Babylonian astronomical tablets shows that some of their data must have been compiled over centuries to reach the level of accuracy they achieved. Predicting lunar eclipses requires long-term observation of lunar cycles. The Saros cycle, a period of approximately 18 years after which eclipses repeat, was known to the Babylonians. But to discover this cycle, you need continuous observations spanning multiple generations. This implies institutional continuity, scribal schools where knowledge was systematically taught, temple observatories where priests watched the sky night after night, year after year, century after century, a civilization that valued knowledge enough to dedicate resources to its preservation and transmission. And it wasn't just astronomy. Babylonian medicine, recorded in diagnostic texts and therapeutic manuals, shows a sophisticated understanding of symptoms and treatments. They couldn't cure many diseases, of course, but they had an empirical approach. They observed, recorded, and tried to identify patterns. This is the beginning of medical science. They also practiced a form of divination called hepatoscopy, examining the livers of sacrificed sheep to predict the future. To modern minds, this seems like superstition. But look closer at what they were actually doing. They were making detailed observations of organ structure, noting variations, and trying to correlate those variations with outcomes. It wasn't scientific in our sense, but it was systematic. It was an attempt to find patterns in nature. The clay models of sheep livers found in Mesopotamian sites, with various features labelled and marked, look remarkably like teaching aids, because that's what they were. Apprentice diviners learned anatomy by studying these models. The practice was considered a sacred art, but it required technical knowledge. Everything in Mesopotamian civilization was intertwined: religion, science, law, economics, art. The temple wasn't just a place of worship, it was an economic center, a school, an observatory, a court, and a repository of knowledge. The priest wasn't just a religious figure, he was an administrator, a scholar, a judge, and a keeper of tradition. This integration of knowledge is something we've lost in the modern world. We separate science from religion, economics from spirituality, art from mathematics. But in Mesopotamia, it was all one thing, all part of the same cosmic order. The Babylonian creation myth, the Enuma Elish, describes how Marduk created the world by defeating the chaos goddess Tiamat. After his victory, Marduk organized the cosmos, setting the stars in their courses, establishing the calendar, creating humanity to serve the gods. This isn't just a religious story, it's a cosmological model, an explanation for why the world is ordered rather than chaotic, and embedded in that myth is a deeper question: why does order exist at all? Modern physics asks the same question in different terms. Why do the laws of nature have the form they do? Why is the universe comprehensible? Why can mathematics describe physical reality? The Mesopotamians didn't have our physics, but they had the same intuition, that beneath the apparent chaos of events there is order, pattern, law, and that human beings through observation and reason can discover that. Order. This is the real legacy of Mesopotamia. Not just the first cities or the first writing, but the first systematic attempt to understand the cosmos and humanity's place within it. And there's something else, something that becomes clear only when you study the texts carefully. The Mesopotamians were obsessed with time, not just marking time, but understanding it. Their astronomical observations weren't just practical, they were searching for cosmic cycles, periods after which the heavens would return to the same configuration, the great year when all the planets would align, the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes the position of the stars to shift over thousands of years. Some researchers believe the Babylonians knew about precession. The mathematical sophistication of their astronomical texts suggests they could have detected it. But direct evidence is sparse, disputed. What's certain is that they were looking for it, looking for the deep rhythms of the cosmos. Why? What drove this obsession with cycles and deep time? Perhaps because they understood something we're only now rediscovering, that civilization itself is cyclical, that it rises and falls, that knowledge can be lost and must be consciously preserved, that the flood, whether literal or metaphorical, can come again. There is a tablet in the British Museum that most visitors walk past without noticing. It's small, unimpressive to the untrained eye, just another piece of baked clay covered in wedge-shaped marks. But what it contains is remarkable. It's called Plimpton 322, and it dates to around 1800 BCE, from the Old Babylonian period. For decades after its discovery, scholars thought it was simply a mathematical exercise tablet, the kind used to teach students. But when mathematicians finally decoded its true purpose, they realized they were looking at something far more sophisticated. Plimpton 322 is a table of Pythagorean triples, sets of three numbers that satisfy the Pythagorean theorem, the kind of mathematics that wouldn't appear in Greece until more than 1,000 years later. But here it was, systematically calculated and recorded by Babylonian scribes who understood not just the relationship, but the underlying mathematical principles. This wasn't accidental knowledge, this was theoretical mathematics, abstract thinking, the kind of intellectual work that requires leisure, education, and a culture that values knowledge for its own sake. And this was just one tablet, one fragment of a vast intellectual tradition that spanned thousands of years. Consider what this means. In 1800 BCE, while most of the world lived in small agricultural communities, Babylonian scribes were doing advanced mathematics. They were calculating the area of irregular fields using geometric principles. They were solving problems that required understanding ratios, proportions, and algebraic relationships without algebraic notation. They did it all in base 60. They could represent fractions with precision we wouldn't match until the development of decimal notation thousands of years later. And they did it on clay tablets, using a reed stylus, pressing cuneiform symbols into wet clay and baking them in the sun. The question isn't just how they did it. The question is why they thought to do it at all. Standard historical narratives suggest that mathematics develops in response to practical needs, surveying land after floods, calculating taxes, measuring grain stores. And yes, the Mesopotamians did all these things. But Plimpton 322 goes beyond practical calculation. It's theoretical, it's exploring mathematical relationships for their own sake. This suggests something profound about Mesopotamian culture. They believed that understanding the patterns beneath reality was itself a sacred act. Mathematics wasn't just useful, it was a way of glimpsing the divine order. The same pattern appears in their astronomical work. Yes, they needed to track the seasons for agricultural purposes. But their observations went far beyond practical necessity. They tracked the movements of planets with obsessive precision, recording positions night after night, compiling data that wouldn't be used for generations. The astronomical diaries from the late Babylonian period, the Seleucid and Parthian eras, contain thousands of observations. Night after night for centuries, priests stood on temple platforms and watched the sky. They noted when planets appeared and disappeared from view. They recorded eclipses. They tracked the moon's position among the stars. And they did something else. Something that reveals just how sophisticated their thinking was. They discovered that celestial phenomena are periodic, that if you watch long enough, patterns emerge. The moon returns to the same position among the stars every 27.3 days. Eclipses follow predictable cycles. Even the complex movements of planets, which seem erratic when viewed night to night, reveal regularities when observed over years and decades. This is empirical science, observation leading to pattern recognition leading to prediction, the same method we use today. But there's a deeper question here, a question that historians of science struggle with. If the Babylonians had this methodology, observation, pattern recognition, prediction, why didn't they develop modern science? They had the mathematics, they had the observational data, they had institutional continuity and a literate class dedicated to preserving knowledge. Why didn't they make the leap to experimental physics, to chemistry, to biology? The standard answer is that they were held back by their religious worldview, that they saw nature as governed by divine will rather than natural law, that their divination practices, reading omens in the stars, in animal entrails, in patterns of oil and water, prevented them from asking scientific questions. But this answer doesn't quite fit the evidence. The Babylonians did believe in divine forces, but they also believed those forces operated according to regular patterns. Their divination wasn't random. It was based on careful observation and systematic correlation. If X happens in the sky, Y happens on Earth. They were looking for causal relationships, even if they framed those relationships in religious terms. In fact, some researchers have argued that Babylonian divination was a proto-science, an early attempt to find order in complex phenomena. The fact that their theoretical framework was wrong doesn't change the fact that their methodology, systematic observation and pattern recognition, was fundamentally sound. What they lacked wasn't intelligence or curiosity. What they lacked was a conceptual breakthrough that wouldn't occur until the Greeks, the idea that nature operates according to impersonal, universal laws that can be discovered through reason alone, independent of divine will. But even here, the picture is more complex than it first appears. The Greeks didn't develop their scientific thinking in isolation. When Thales, often called the first Greek philosopher, predicted a solar eclipse in 585 BCE, he was using Babylonian astronomical data. When Pythagoras developed his theorem, he may have been building on Babylonian mathematical knowledge that was already ancient when he encountered it. The Persian Empire, which controlled Mesopotamia from 539 BCE onward, became a conduit for knowledge transfer. Persian policies of religious tolerance and cultural preservation meant that Babylonian temples continued to function, scribes continued to copy texts, and knowledge continued to accumulate. When Greeks came to Babylon, as soldiers with Alexander, as merchants, as scholars, they encountered an intellectual tradition that made their own look young. Some of that knowledge was absorbed, some was translated, some was simply borrowed without acknowledgement, the way all cultures borrow from those that came before. But something else happened too, something that gets less attention but may be more important. The Greeks began asking different questions. They weren't content with observation and pattern recognition. They wanted to know why. What causes things to be the way they are? What is the fundamental nature of reality? These questions led to philosophy, to atomism, the idea that matter is composed of indivisible particles, to theories of geometry that were divorced from practical measurement, to logic as a formal system. The Mesopotamians had the empirical foundation, the Greeks added the theoretical superstructure. And centuries later, when Islamic scholars in Baghdad synthesized Greek philosophy with Persian and Indian mathematics and whatever remnants of Babylonian knowledge still survived, they created something new, a scientific tradition that would eventually transform into modern science. But here's what haunts anyone who studies this history carefully. How much was lost in the transitions? When cuneiform died as a living script around 75 CE, access to 3,000 years of accumulated knowledge was cut off. Some texts had been translated into Greek or Aramaic, but most hadn't. Most simply became unreadable artifacts. For over 1,700 years, no one could read cuneiform. The cities of Mesopotamia crumbled into tells. Artificial hills made of collapsed mud brick buildings, layer upon layer of human habitation. The tablets were still there, buried in the ruins, but they were meaningless, just clay fragments with strange marks. It wasn't until the 19th century that European archaeologists and linguists finally deciphered cuneiform, and what they found astonished them. Epic poems like Gilgamesh, revealing that the biblical flood story had much older antecedents. Law codes predating Moses by 1,000 years. Astronomical tablets showing that the ancients had understood planetary motion with surprising accuracy. Mathematical texts demonstrating geometric knowledge that Europeans had believed was uniquely Greek. Each new translation revealed more, and each revelation raised the same troubling question. What else did they know that we haven't found yet? We have perhaps 5% of Mesopotamian literature, maybe less. That's an estimate based on catalogues of library holdings recorded in ancient texts, compared to what's actually been found. Most clay tablets haven't survived. Those that did are fragmentary, and many sites haven't been excavated yet, or can't be because they're in conflict zones. Iraq has been at war, on and off, for decades. Archaeological sites have been looted. Museums have been destroyed. In 2003, during the invasion of Iraq, the National Museum in Baghdad was ransacked. Thousands of artifacts were stolen, including irreplaceable tablets from the earliest periods of Mesopotamian history. Some were later recovered, many are gone forever. It's a particular kind of tragedy. Not just the loss of objects, but the loss of knowledge, information that existed nowhere else, questions that could have been answered, now lost again, perhaps permanently. And yet what survives still has power, still speaks to us across the millennia. Listen to this from the Epic of Gilgamesh, when the hero finally accepts his mortality, the life that you are seeking you will never find. When the gods created man, they allotted to him death, but life they retained in their own keeping. This was written 4,000 years ago, and it still resonates, because the fundamental questions haven't changed. Why do we die? What gives life meaning? How should we live in the face of mortality? Gilgamesh's answer, after his failed quest for immortality, is to build something lasting. The walls of Uruk, his name carved in stone, his deeds recorded for posterity. This is how humans defeat death, not by living forever, but by being remembered. The Mesopotamians understood this deeply. It's why they wrote everything down, why they copied ancient texts even when the language had become archaic, why they preserved king lists going back to mythical times. They were building monuments of memory, more durable than stone, and they were right. The cities are ruins, the empires are dust, but the tablets remain, the ideas remain, the questions remain. There's a concept in archaeology called cultural memory, the way societies preserve and transmit knowledge of their past. The Mesopotamians were masters of cultural memory. They didn't just record recent history, they maintained connections to their deep past, even when that past was partially mythological. The Babylonians of the first millennium BCE still told stories about Gilgamesh, who had lived 2,000 years earlier. They still studied Sumerian, even though it was no longer spoken, because it was the language of their most ancient texts. They still celebrated festivals that had been old when Hammurabi was young. This is remarkable. Most cultures forget their deep past within a few generations. Oral traditions distort and simplify. Written records decay. But Mesopotamian scribal culture maintained a continuous chain of transmission spanning 3,000 years. Why? What motivated generation after generation of scribes to copy out ancient texts, to maintain libraries, to teach young students the complicated, cuneiform script, when alphabetic writing was simpler and more efficient? The answer appears repeatedly in their texts. They saw themselves as guardians, not just of knowledge, but of cosmic order itself, the proper performance of rituals, the correct recitation of ancient hymns, the accurate transmission of astronomical observations. These weren't just cultural practices, they were necessary for maintaining the stability of the universe. This might seem like superstition to modern minds, but consider what they were really doing. They were maintaining institutional knowledge across generations. They were preserving technical expertise. They were ensuring that hard-won understanding wasn't lost when individuals died. In our terms, they were preventing civilizational collapse, and they knew that collapse was possible. Their own history taught them. The Akkadian Empire had collapsed. The UR3 state had fallen. The old Babylonian period had ended in chaos. Cities had been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times. They had seen repeatedly that civilization is fragile, so they built redundancy into the system, multiple copies of important texts, scribal schools in multiple cities, standardized training so that scribes in different locations would preserve texts the same way. This is information theory, applied intuitively by people who understood that knowledge must be actively preserved or it will be lost. There is a moment in the historical record that reveals something profound about how civilizations remember and forget. In the 7th century BCE, the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal created the most ambitious library the ancient world had ever seen. Not content with simply collecting tablets, he sent scribes throughout his empire with a specific mandate: find every text of value and bring it to Nineveh. Medical treatises, astronomical observations, omen compilations, literary works, historical chronicles, religious hymns, everything. But Ashurbanipal wanted more than just contemporary texts. He wanted ancient knowledge. His scribes were instructed to seek out old copies, to find tablets from abandoned cities, to recover works that had survived from Sumerian times. He was deliberately trying to reconstruct the intellectual heritage of Mesopotamia, reaching back across 1,000 years or more. This wasn't just royal vanity. Ashurbanipal could read and write unusual for a king. He understood that power came not just from armies, but from knowledge, and he understood that knowledge was being lost. Think about what this means. By 650 BCE, texts from the old Babylonian period were already ancient manuscripts, difficult to find, written in an archaic dialect. Sumerian literature was even more remote, a dead language that had to be learned through bilingual dictionaries and interlinear translations. Yet Ashurbanipal recognized their value enough to dedicate significant resources to their recovery and preservation. He was creating a time capsule, a repository of everything Mesopotamian civilization had learned over 2,000 years. And when Nineveh fell in 612 BCE, when the Medes and Babylonians sacked the city and burned it to the ground, that time capsule was sealed. The fire that destroyed Nineveh baked the clay tablets, turning them into ceramic-hard artifacts that would survive millennia buried in the rubble. Without that accidental preservation, we would know almost nothing about Mesopotamian literature, mythology, or science. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish creation myth, detailed astronomical observations, medical texts, dictionaries, all of it would have been lost. It's a strange irony. Destruction preserved what careful curation could not. But here's the deeper question. What did Ashurbanipal himself think he was preserving? What did he believe he had found in those ancient texts? We know from his own inscriptions that he valued the wisdom of the Apkallu, the antediluvian sages. He collected texts that claimed to contain pre-flood knowledge. He was particularly interested in astronomical omens and divination series that claimed to be based on observations stretching back to mythical times. Was he simply superstitious, believing in literal pre-flood sages? Or did he understand in some intuitive way that there was genuine ancient knowledge embedded in these traditions? Knowledge that had been systematically observed, recorded, and transmitted across vast spans of time. Modern scholarship tends to assume the former, but the evidence suggests something more nuanced. The astronomical texts Ashurbanipal collected contain real data, observations that had been accumulating for centuries, perhaps longer. The mathematical tablets show genuine understanding of advanced concepts. The medical texts, while mixed with what we would call magic, also contain empirical observations about symptoms and treatments that clearly came from long experience. Embedded in the mythological framework was real knowledge, and Ashurbanipal, for all his belief in omens and divine favour, recognized that and tried to preserve it. This is the pattern throughout Mesopotamian history: knowledge wrapped in mythology, science embedded in religion, empirical observation interpreted through a divine framework. But the framework didn't prevent the observation. If anything, it motivated it. Consider the astronomical diaries again. Why did Babylonian priests spend night after night watching the sky, recording planetary positions with meticulous care? Because they believed the gods communicated through celestial phenomena. The movements of planets were divine messages that needed to be read, interpreted, understood. This belief system created an incentive structure for systematic observation. The religious motivation produced scientific data, and that data accumulated over centuries into a body of knowledge that could be used to make genuine predictions that worked regardless of whether the gods actually existed. By the time of the Seleucid period, in the last centuries BCE, Babylonian astronomers could predict lunar eclipses years in advance with remarkable accuracy. They had identified multiple periodic cycles and celestial motions. They had created mathematical models of planetary movement that could be used for calculation without direct observation. This is sophisticated mathematical astronomy. And it was achieved by people who believed they were reading divine omens. The same pattern appears in medicine. Babylonian diagnostic texts describe symptoms in careful detail. They note the progression of diseases, the effectiveness of various treatments, and the likely outcomes. This is empirical medicine based on observation and experience, but it's framed in terms of demons and divine punishment. Illness is caused by angry gods or malevolent spirits. Treatment involves not just practical remedies, but also incantations, rituals, and appeals to healing deities. To modern eyes, this looks like confusion, a failure to separate medicine from magic. But look closer. The diagnostic observations are accurate. The treatments, while often ineffective by our standards, show an understanding of what we would call palliative care, and most importantly, they were recording their experiences and transmitting that knowledge to future generations. The theoretical framework was wrong, but the methodology, observe, record, look for patterns, try to predict and influence outcomes, was sound. This raises an uncomfortable question for those who believe scientific thinking is uniquely modern. What if the Mesopotamians were doing science, just within a different conceptual framework? What if the difference between their approach and ours is not one of method, but of interpretation? We observe natural phenomena and interpret them through the framework of impersonal laws. They observed the same phenomena and interpreted them through the framework of divine will. But both approaches involve systematic observation, pattern recognition, and attempts at prediction. The key difference is that our framework proved more productive. It led to better predictions, more effective interventions, and a deeper understanding of causal relationships. But that doesn't mean their approach was worthless. It preserved knowledge. It motivated sustained observation. It created institutions capable of transmitting technical expertise across generations. And in some areas, they may have understood things we've forgotten. There's a tradition in Mesopotamian texts of secret knowledge, wisdom that was deliberately restricted to initiated priests, mathematical techniques that were guarded professional secrets, astronomical methods that were not recorded in full because they were meant to be transmitted orally from master to apprentice. We know this because some texts explicitly state that certain knowledge should not be written down or should be kept secret from the uninitiated. Other texts are clearly abbreviated, assuming the reader already knows the full context. They're more like lecture notes than comprehensive explanations. What was in that secret knowledge? We can only speculate based on fragmentary hints, but some researchers believe it included sophisticated mathematical techniques, particularly for astronomical calculations. The Babylonians could do things with their mathematics that we can replicate but don't fully understand how they discovered. For example, they had methods for solving what we would call second-degree polynomial equations, problems involving squared terms. But they didn't have algebraic notation. They solved these problems geometrically, visualizing relationships between areas and sides of figures. How they made the conceptual leap from geometric visualization to abstract calculation is still debated. Similarly, their astronomical models involved what modern scholars call systems A and B, two different mathematical approaches to calculating planetary positions. These systems use different underlying assumptions but produce similar results. Why did the Babylonians develop two different systems? Were they comparing approaches to see which worked better? Or were these the products of different schools of thought, different lineages of astronomical knowledge? We don't know. The texts don't explain their reasoning, they just present the methods. This is frustrating for historians trying to reconstruct Mesopotamian science, but it tells us something important. The Babylonians had reached a level of abstraction where methods could be transmitted without full explanations. They had developed professional expertise that went beyond what could be easily recorded in writing. In other words, they had what we would call tacit knowledge, understanding that exists in practice but is difficult to articulate explicitly. The kind of knowledge that a master craftsman has but struggles to explain to an apprentice. The kind of knowledge that can be lost if the chain of transmission is broken. And the chain was broken when cuneiform ceased to be a living script, when the scribal schools closed, when the last generation of priests who understood the old ways died. All that tacit knowledge died with them. We have the texts, we can read the methods, but we may not fully understand the thinking behind them. The conceptual frameworks, the ways of visualizing problems, the intuitive leaps that made the mathematics work. These were transmitted orally, demonstrated practically, and they're gone. This is what makes the study of Mesopotamian science both fascinating and melancholy. We're looking at the artifacts of a sophisticated intellectual tradition, trying to reverse engineer the thinking that produced them. And we're constantly aware that we're missing pieces, that there were depths to their understanding we can only glimpse through fragmentary evidence. But occasionally, something surfaces that hints at those depths. In 1986, a French expedition excavating at Sippar, one of the ancient cities of Babylonia, discovered a cache of tablets that had been buried in antiquity. Among them were astronomical texts unlike anything previously found. They contained observations and calculations that pushed back the dates of known Babylonian astronomy by centuries. What was remarkable wasn't just the age of the texts, it was their sophistication. These weren't primitive first attempts at astronomy. They were already using advanced techniques already, working within an established tradition, which meant the tradition was even older than the tablets themselves. How much older? We don't know. The tablets themselves don't say. They simply assume the reader already understands the context, already knows the methods. They're working documents, not textbooks. This pattern repeats throughout Mesopotamian archaeology. Whenever we find earlier examples of a practice, they are already sophisticated, already showing signs of a developed tradition. The true beginnings always seem to recede further into the past. The earliest cities are already well organized. The earliest writing is already capable of expressing complex ideas. The earliest mathematics is already using advanced techniques. The earliest astronomical texts are already making accurate predictions. It's as if we're always arriving too late to see the actual beginning. We see the mature tradition, the developed practice, but the experimental phase, the early attempts, the process of discovery, that's always just out of reach, buried deeper in time. Some researchers have suggested this means we're missing an entire phase of Mesopotamian development, that there was an earlier period, perhaps in the Ubaid era before the rise of Sumerian cities, when the foundational discoveries were made. When writing was first developed, mathematics first explored, astronomical observations first systematically recorded. But if that earlier phase existed, its material remains are scarce. We have Ubaid pottery and simple temple platforms. We don't have the tablets that would show the development of writing or mathematics. Either they didn't exist, or they were on perishable materials that Haven Tea survived, or they're still buried somewhere waiting to be found, or, and this is where speculation becomes unavoidable, the knowledge came from somewhere else, from the people the Mesopotamians themselves credited with teaching them civilization, the Apkallu, the sages from before the flood. The story of the Apkallu appears repeatedly in Mesopotamian literature, consistent across thousands of years. 7 sages, neither fully human nor fully divine, emerged from the waters of the Abzu, the primordial ocean, during the time before the flood. Each was associated with one of the antediluvian cities, and each taught humanity the essential arts of civilization. Adapa, the first and wisest, taught the proper performance of rituals and the sacred duties of kingship. Yuanduga, who came after, taught divination and the interpretation of omens. Others taught architecture, metalworking, agriculture, and the organization of society. Together, they transformed humanity from primitive beings into civilized people capable of building cities and maintaining complex social orders. Then came the flood, and the Apkallu vanished from the earth, returning to the Abzu from which they had come. But their knowledge remained, preserved in the scribal schools, guarded by the priesthoods, passed down through careful instruction from generation to generation. This is mythology, of course, but it's mythology with a purpose. It's a cultural memory of knowledge transmission, formalized into narrative form, and like all myths, it may contain traces of historical reality, distorted by time and wrapped in symbol. What if we strip away the supernatural elements and look at the core claim? That Mesopotamian civilization received its foundational knowledge from an earlier source. That the sophistication we see at the dawn of recorded history wasn't invented from scratch, but inherited and adapted from something that came before. Is there any evidence for this? The archaeological record shows a rapid transition from the Ubaid period to the Uruk period, from simple villages to complex cities, in just a few centuries. This transition around 4000 to 3500 BCE saw the emergence of monumental architecture, specialized crafts, long-distance trade networks, administrative systems, and eventually writing. Standard archaeological interpretation calls this the urban revolution, the natural result of agricultural surplus, population growth, and social complexity reaching a critical threshold. But the speed of the transformation has always been puzzling, and the lack of clear transitional forms, the absence of proto-cities showing gradual development, makes the revolution look more like a sudden leap than a gradual evolution. Some researchers have suggested that the catalyst came from outside, that there was contact with a more advanced culture or migration of people who already possessed urban skills. The Ubaid culture itself shows evidence of maritime trade, suggesting contact with populations around the Persian Gulf. Could knowledge have been transmitted through these trade networks? The Persian Gulf hypothesis becomes more interesting when you consider sea level changes. At the end of the last ice age, the Persian Gulf basin was dry land, a vast river valley watered by the Tigris, Euphrates, Karun, and other rivers. It would have been prime agricultural land, potentially supporting large populations. Then the ice sheets melted, sea levels rose over 100 meters. And that entire valley flooded, slowly at first, then catastrophically, as the narrow strait connecting the Gulf to the ocean was breached. The process took centuries, but from the perspective of people living through it, watching the sea advance year by year, it would have seemed like the world was ending if there were sophisticated settlements in that drowned valley. And we have no way to know because they're now underwater. Their populations would have been forced to migrate. Some might have moved north, up the river valleys into what became southern Mesopotamia, bringing with them whatever knowledge and skills they had developed. This is speculation. Underwater archaeology in the Persian Gulf is in its infancy, and the conditions are difficult. But the hypothesis fits both the archaeological evidence and the mythological memory, a pre-flood civilization in a land that was flooded. Survivors who brought their knowledge to the cities that would become Sumer. The Mesopotamians themselves placed their antediluvian cities in the south, near the Gulf, and they described the flood as a real historical event, not merely a myth. The Sumerian king list divides history clearly: kings who reigned before the flood and kings who reigned after. The break is absolute. Something happened, whether it was a literal global flood, a regional catastrophe, or a cultural memory of sea level rise, doesn't change the essential point. The Mesopotamians believed their civilization had been interrupted and reconstituted, that there was a before and an after, and that preserving the knowledge from before was one of their sacred duties. This belief shaped their entire approach to learning and cultural transmission. They weren't just recording contemporary information, they were custodians of ancient wisdom, protecting it from being lost again. And they had reason to be concerned. Mesopotamian history is punctuated by collapses. The Akkadian Empire fell around 2200 BCE, possibly due to climate change that caused widespread drought. Cities were abandoned. Trade networks broke down. Population declined sharply. It took over a century for the region to recover. The UR3 state collapsed around 2000 BCE, again followed by a period of political fragmentation and reduced urban population. The old Babylonian period ended in chaos around 1600 BCE, when the Hittites sacked Babylon and the Kassites took control. Each collapse threatened the accumulated knowledge of civilization. Libraries could be destroyed. Scribal schools could close. Skilled professionals could die without passing on their expertise. The chain of transmission could break. Yet somehow, through all these crises, the core knowledge survived. Someone always preserved the texts, maintained the traditions, taught the next generation. The institutional framework of temples and scribal schools provided continuity even when political structures collapsed. This wasn't automatic. It required deliberate effort and conscious choice. Scribes who continued copying texts even when there was no immediate practical need. Priests who maintained astronomical observations even during sieges and famines. Teachers who trained students in ancient languages even when those languages were no longer spoken. They were doing what the Apkallu had supposedly done at the beginning, preserving and transmitting the knowledge necessary for civilization to continue. But there's another dimension to the Apkallu tradition that deserves attention. These sages weren't just teachers, they were described as advisors to kings, helping rulers make wise decisions. Each antediluvian king had his Apkallu, his source of divine wisdom. This tradition continued after the flood kings claimed to have divine advisors, to receive wisdom from the gods through dreams or omens. But they also employed human sages, scholars who advised on everything from military strategy to building projects to legal reforms. Hammurabi, when he compiled his famous law code around 1750 BCE, wasn't inventing law from scratch. He was codifying and systematizing legal traditions that had been developing for centuries. He consulted with scribes who knew the older law codes, who understood the precedents and principles. He was drawing on accumulated wisdom, not personal inspiration. The same pattern appears with astronomical observations. No single astronomer discovered the Saros cycle or the patterns of planetary motion. These were insights that emerged from centuries of collective observation, recorded and analysed by generations of scholars working within an institutional framework. This is what separates civilization from simple culture. Civilization has mechanisms for accumulating knowledge across generations. It doesn't have to start from zero with each new generation. The young can build on what the old have learned, but this only works if the knowledge is properly preserved and transmitted. And the Mesopotamians understood this better than almost any other ancient civilization. Their scribal culture was specifically designed to prevent knowledge loss. Consider the practice of copying texts. When a scribe copied an ancient tablet, he would often add a colophon at the end, a note saying who he was when he made the copy, and sometimes where he found the original. These colophons are invaluable for tracking the transmission of texts across time and space, but they also reveal something about scribal attitudes. The scribes weren't just mechanical copiers, they were conscious custodians of tradition. They noted when a tablet was damaged and they had to reconstruct missing sections. They indicated when they weren't certain about a reading. They sometimes added explanatory notes for words that had become archaic. They were thinking about future readers, trying to make sure that centuries later, someone would still be able to understand the text. This is the mindset of people who think in terms of deep time, who understand that knowledge must be actively maintained or it will decay, and they had developed techniques for ensuring accuracy. Tablets were often copied multiple times, allowing comparison to catch errors. Important texts were stored in multiple locations, providing redundancy. Standardized versions of literary works were maintained alongside local variations, allowing scholars to identify and correct copyist mistakes. This is information science, practiced intuitively by people who understood that data corruption is a real risk when transmitting knowledge across time. Modern digital archiving uses similar principles: multiple copies, error correction codes, format standardization. We've simply made explicit what the Mesopotamian scribes understood implicitly, that information wants to decay, and preserving. It requires active effort. But there's a paradox here. The Mesopotamians were so successful at preserving knowledge that they may have preserved too much. Not all information is equally valuable. Not all texts deserve to be copied and transmitted across millennia. The great libraries of Mesopotamia contained not just literary masterpieces and scientific observations, but also routine administrative records, personal letters, school exercises, and what we might call junk, texts that had temporary value but no lasting significance. Ashurbanipal's library, for all its treasures, also contained omen series so extensive and repetitive that modern scholars struggle to see their value. Compilations of every possible variation of liver markings and their divinatory meanings. Lists of omens derived from oil patterns on water, from smoke rising from incense, from the behavior of animals. Why preserve all of this? What purpose did it serve? The answer seems to be that the Mesopotamians didn't fully trust their ability to distinguish essential knowledge from non-essential. They had experienced collapses. They knew that what seems unimportant in one era might become critical in another. So they tried to preserve everything, or at least everything they had the resources to copy and maintain. This maximalist approach to preservation meant that when cuneiform was finally deciphered in the 19th century, scholars found themselves drowning in data, hundreds of thousands of tablets, most containing mundane information. Finding the significant texts among the routine records required years of sorting and cataloguing, but it also meant that nothing important was deliberately discarded. If a text survived at all, it survived in context, surrounded by the everyday documents that show how knowledge was actually used. We can see not just the final polished versions of literary works, but also school copies showing how students learned, not just astronomical theories, but also the raw, observational data that supported them. Not just law codes, but also court records showing how laws were applied in practice. This contextual information is invaluable for understanding Mesopotamian civilization. It shows us not just what they knew, but how they knew it, how knowledge was taught, tested, applied, and transmitted. And occasionally, it shows us something unexpected. A student exercise tablet that preserves a fragment of a text otherwise unknown. A routine administrative document that mentions a historical event never recorded elsewhere. A personal letter that reveals attitudes and concerns that official documents never mention. History isn't just made by kings and priests. It's made by ordinary people going about their daily lives, writing letters, keeping accounts, teaching children, maintaining traditions. The Mesopotamian archives capture this texture of daily life in a way that few other ancient civilizations do. But again, we return to the troubling question, how much is missing? The Rivers of Eternity, Mesopotamia, and the Dawn of Forgotten Time, Part 6 of 10, in the ruins of Nippur, one of the most sacred cities of ancient Mesopotamia. Archaeologists found something that changed their understanding of how knowledge was preserved. It was a house, buried under meters of later construction, dating to around 1700 BCE. Inside were thousands of tablet fragments, not in a temple or palace, but in a private residence. This was the home of a scribal family. Multiple generations had lived here, teaching, copying texts, maintaining a personal library. The tablets ranged from elementary school exercises to advanced mathematical problems to literary works. The house itself was a scribal school, one of dozens or perhaps hundreds that must have existed throughout Mesopotamian cities. This discovery revealed something crucial. Knowledge preservation wasn't just centralized in great temples and royal libraries. It was distributed throughout society in the hands. Professional families who made it their life's work to transmit learning across generations. When we think about how civilizations preserve knowledge, we tend to imagine grand institutions, the Library of Alexandria, medieval monasteries, modern universities. And these institutions did exist in Mesopotamia. The temples had extensive libraries. Royal palaces collected texts. But the real work of transmission happened in houses like the one at Nippur, where a father taught his son, who taught his son, who taught his son, carrying techniques and texts forward through time. This distributed model of knowledge preservation was remarkably resilient. When a city was sacked, when a temple burned, when a king's library was looted, the knowledge didn't completely disappear. It existed in copies held by scribal families in other cities. It survived in the memories of teachers who could recreate texts from memory if necessary. It persisted in the standardized curriculum that meant students everywhere learned the same core material, but it also meant that knowledge could fragment. Different schools could develop different traditions. Regional variations could emerge. And critically, if an entire class of knowledge keepers died without passing on their expertise, that knowledge could vanish completely. This apparently happened with Sumerian. By the old Babylonian period, around 2000 to 1600 BCE, Sumerian was no longer spoken as a living language. It survived only as a learned language, studied by scribes the way Latin was studied in medieval Europe. But unlike Latin, which continued to be taught for over 1,000 years after it ceased being spoken, Sumerian instruction eventually faded. By the first millennium BCE, very few scribes could still read Sumerian fluently. The language was becoming inaccessible even to educated Mesopotamians, and when cuneiform itself died, Sumerian became completely unreadable for nearly 2,000 years until modern scholars rediscovered the bilingual dictionaries that allowed them to crack the language. What was lost in that transition? We know we're missing most of Sumerian literature. The tablets we have are mostly from the old Babylonian period, copies made by students learning the language. The original Sumerian literary tradition, from the time when Sumerian was still spoken, must have been much larger, but those texts are gone, either destroyed or buried in unexcavated sites, or simply never preserved because they seemed unimportant once the language died. The same pattern of loss through linguistic transition appears elsewhere in history. When Linear B, the writing system of Mycenaean Greek, was abandoned around 1200 BCE, all the administrative knowledge encoded in it became inaccessible. When Mayan hieroglyphic writing ceased to be used after the Spanish conquest, centuries of historical and astronomical records became unreadable. When Egyptian hieroglyphics were no longer understood after the Roman period, an entire civilization's voice fell silent. Writing preserves knowledge, but only if someone can still read it. And reading requires continuity, an unbroken chain of teachers and students across generations. Break that chain, and the preservation fails. The Mesopotamians seem to have understood this danger. It's why they maintained scribal schools even during times of political collapse, why they continued teaching dead languages, why they copied ancient texts that no longer had any practical use. They were fighting against entropy, against the natural tendency for knowledge to decay and be forgotten. And they were remarkably successful. For 3,000 years, they maintained institutional continuity. But eventually the chain did break, and when it did, the accumulated knowledge of millennia became archaeology. Yet even in death, the clay tablets had one final advantage over every other writing medium. They survived. Papyrus rotted, parchment decayed, wooden tablets burned. But clay, especially when fired, lasts essentially forever. Tablets buried in the ground for thousands of years emerged intact, ready to be read if only someone could decipher the script. This accidental durability has given us a window into Mesopotamian civilization that we lack for most other ancient cultures. We can read their literature, their laws, their letters, their receipts, their astronomical observations, their mathematical exercises. We can reconstruct not just the outline of their history, but the texture of their thought. And what we find is both familiar and alien. Familiar because they were humans dealing with the same fundamental challenges we face. Alien because they understood those challenges through a completely different conceptual framework. Take their understanding of time. We think of time as linear, moving in one direction from past through present to future. We measure it in discrete units, seconds, minutes, hours, that flow at a constant rate. This seems natural to us, self-evident, but it's actually a culturally constructed way of thinking about time. The Mesopotamians had a different conception. They saw time as cyclical, returning to the same configurations. The astronomical cycles, the day, the month, the year, repeated endlessly. Historical events had patterns. Kings rose and fell in predictable rhythms. Even the cosmos itself might be cyclical, returning after vast periods to its initial state. This cyclical understanding of time had practical implications. It meant that past patterns could predict future events. It justified divination. If history repeats, then understanding past correlations between celestial phenomena and earthly events could help predict future correlations. It made the study of the past not just interesting, but necessary for anticipating the future. It also meant that true novelty was suspect. New things were unstable, untested. Old things were proven, reliable, sanctioned by tradition. Innovation happened, but it was framed as restoration, not inventing something new, but recovering something ancient that had been lost or forgotten. This is why Mesopotamian kings claimed to be restoring ancient temples rather than building new ones. why they trace their authority back to primordial times when kingship first descended from heaven, why even revolutionary changes were presented as returns to earlier practice. The cultural logic valued antiquity over novelty. This attitude seems strange to modern minds that valorize innovation and progress. But it had advantages. It created strong incentives to preserve ancient knowledge. It meant that each generation saw itself not as surpassing the past, but as continuing it. It fostered the kind of cultural continuity that allowed knowledge to accumulate over centuries, and it may have reflected genuine insight. The Mesopotamians had lived through collapses. They had seen sophisticated civilizations fall and knowledge be lost. They understood that human progress isn't inevitable, that civilization can regress as well as advance, that sometimes the ancients really did know things that later generations had forgotten. We're rediscovering this truth today. Archaeologists keep finding evidence that ancient peoples understood things we assumed were modern discoveries. The Antikythera mechanism shows that ancient Greeks built sophisticated analog computers. Roman concrete has properties we're still trying to replicate. Indigenous agricultural techniques prove more sustainable than industrial methods. The ancients weren't primitive. They were the inheritors of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge and experience. And the Mesopotamians, being among the most ancient, were the inheritors of the longest traditions. But there's something else in the Mesopotamian understanding of time that deserves attention. They didn't just think time was cyclical. They thought certain periods of time were qualitatively different from others, that there were ages when the gods walked more closely with humans, when magic worked more strongly, when knowledge was more accessible. The time before the flood was such an age of direct divine instruction, an age when humans lived longer, built greater works, possessed wisdom that was later lost. The flood marked a rupture, a transition to a diminished age when humans had to work harder for knowledge, when divine contact was less direct, when civilization was more fragile. This is mythology, but it's mythology that maps onto a real pattern in human prehistory. There was a rupture, the end of the Ice Age, the flooding of vast coastal areas, climate disruptions that forced populations to migrate and adapt. And after that rupture, civilization as we recognize it began to emerge, not gradually everywhere, but rapidly in specific locations. The Fertile Crescent, the Nile Valley, the Indus River, the Yellow River. Within a few thousand years of each other, complex urban civilizations appeared in these scattered locations, each developing writing, monumental architecture, hierarchical social structures, and specialized crafts. Why these places? Why this timing? The standard explanation is agriculture. These river valleys provided the agricultural surplus necessary to support urban populations. But agriculture itself had been developing for thousands of years before cities appeared. Why the sudden threshold? Some researchers have suggested that these early civilizations were in contact, exchanging ideas and techniques, that once the basic template of urban life was established in one location, it could spread to others through trade networks and cultural diffusion. But the differences between these civilizations are as striking as the similarities. They developed different writing systems, different architectural styles, different religious traditions. They seem to have solved similar problems independently rather than copying solutions from each other, unless they were all drawing on an earlier template. Knowledge preserved from before the climate disruptions, techniques maintained by populations who remembered how their ancestors had organized complex societies before the floods came. This is speculation verging on fantasy. There's no direct evidence for a pre-Ice Age civilization that possessed urban planning, writing, and advanced social organization. The archaeological record doesn't show it, but the archaeological record is incomplete. especially for coastal areas that are now underwater. And the mythology is consistent, not just in Mesopotamia, but globally. Stories of ancient catastrophes, lost civilizations, ages when humanity was wiser or closer to the divine. These stories could all be independent inventions. The human mind naturally creates such narratives. Or they could all be distorted memories of real events, preserved through oral tradition and eventually written down. We'll probably never know for certain. But what we can say is that the Mesopotamians themselves believed they were the inheritors of ancient wisdom, that their civilization was built on foundations laid long before, and they structured their entire intellectual culture around preserving and transmitting that wisdom. Whether the wisdom was truly ancient or simply attributed to the ancient past doesn't change the practical effect. It created a culture of conservation, of careful transmission, of reverence for accumulated knowledge. There is a text from the reign of Nabonidus, the last king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, that reveals something profound about how ancient peoples understood their relationship to the past. Nabonidus claimed to have discovered the foundation stone of a temple that had been laid by Naram-Sin, a king of the Akkadian Empire who had lived 1700 years earlier. 1700 years. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the same temporal distance between us and the fall of Rome. Imagine excavating Roman foundations and using them as a guide for modern construction. It seems absurd. Yet this is exactly what Nabonidus claimed to do and what many Mesopotamian kings before him had done. But here's what's remarkable. When archaeologists excavated the sites these texts describe, they found that the ancient kings were often correct. The foundation stones were where the texts said they would be. The measurements matched. The inscriptions, when found, confirmed the claims. These weren't pious frauds. These were genuine archaeological recoveries carried out thousands of years before archaeology existed as a discipline. Nabonidus in particular seems to have been obsessed with the deep past. He conducted excavations at multiple sites, searching for ancient foundations. He restored temples according to what he believed were their original plans. He collected ancient inscriptions and displayed them in a kind of museum. His daughter, the priestess Enhedu Anna, was named after the famous poet-priestess who had lived 1500 years earlier. A deliberate connection across vast time. Why this obsession? The standard historical explanation is that Nabonidus was trying to legitimate his rule by connecting himself to ancient traditions. He wasn't from the traditional royal lineage, so he needed to establish authority through other means. Claiming to restore ancient practices was a way to present himself as the rightful heir to Mesopotamian kingship. This is probably true, but it doesn't explain the depth of his engagement with the past. He wasn't just paying lip service to tradition. He was actively researching it, excavating it, trying to understand it on its own terms. He was doing history, in a world where history as we understand it didn't quite exist yet, and his interests went beyond royal legitimation. Nabonidus was particularly concerned with astronomical observations and chronology. He wanted to know exactly when past events had occurred, how long previous dynasties had lasted, what celestial phenomena had accompanied important historical moments. He was trying to construct an accurate timeline of the past, reaching back as far as records existed. Why does chronology matter? Because if time is cyclical, if patterns repeat, then knowing the exact timing of past events helps predict future ones. The Mesopotamians believed that certain periods of time were auspicious or inauspicious, that historical patterns recurred at regular intervals, that understanding past cycles was key to navigating future ones. This is why astronomical observations were so important. The heavens moved in predictable cycles, daily, monthly, yearly, and in longer periods that took decades or centuries to complete. If earthly events correlated with celestial cycles, then accurate astronomical records were the key to understanding history and predicting the future. Modern historians tend to dismiss this as primitive superstition. But look at what the Mesopotamians were actually doing. They were collecting long-term observational data. They were looking for correlations between different types of phenomena. They were trying to build predictive models based on empirical evidence. The theoretical framework was wrong. Celestial motions don't actually cause earthly events through divine agency. But the methodology was sound, and the data they collected was real, accurate, and eventually contributed to the development of genuine astronomical science. Nabonidus, for all his archaism, was participating in this intellectual tradition. He was trying to extend the historical record as far back as possible to give astronomers and chronologists more data to work with. He understood that knowledge accumulates over time, that longer observational baselines produce better understanding. But his reign ended badly. His religious reforms, particularly his elevation of the moon god Sin over Marduk, the traditional patron deity of Babylon, alienated the powerful Marduk priesthood. His extended absence from Babylon, spending years in the Arabian desert oasis of Tamar, created political instability. When Cyrus the Great of Persia invaded in 539 BCE, Babylon fell with minimal resistance. The priesthood of Marduk apparently welcomed Cyrus as a liberator, and thus ended the last native Mesopotamian dynasty. After more than 3,000 years of continuous civilization, Mesopotamia came under foreign rule. First Persian, then Macedonian, then Seleucid Greek, then Parthian, then Sasanian Persian, then Arab Islamic. The cities that had been centers of learning for millennia gradually declined, their populations drifting away to newer capitals like Seleucia and Baghdad. But the knowledge didn't entirely disappear, it transformed. When the Persians conquered Babylon, they didn't destroy its intellectual traditions. Quite the opposite. The Achaemenid Persian Empire was relatively tolerant of local customs and actively interested in accumulating knowledge from conquered territories. Persian administrators learned to read cuneiform. Persian kings, like Darius, adopted Mesopotamian royal titulature and administrative practices, and critically, they maintained the temple establishments that had been the centers of learning. The astronomical observations continued. The scribal schools remained open. The copying of ancient texts went on. Under Persian rule, Babylonian intellectual life actually flourished in some ways. The astronomical diaries from the Persian period are among the most detailed and systematic we have. When Alexander conquered Persia, he found Babylonian astronomy so impressive that he reportedly sent astronomical data back to his former tutor, Aristotle. Greek scholars began studying Babylonian methods, translating texts, incorporating Mesopotamian knowledge into their own developing scientific traditions. This is how knowledge survives the fall of civilizations, not through preservation in aspic, but through transmission, translation, incorporation into new contexts. The Greeks didn't just copy Babylonian astronomy. They transformed it, adding their own geometric models and theoretical frameworks. But they couldn't have done it without the empirical foundation that Mesopotamia provided. The same thing happened with mathematics. Greek mathematics is famous for its logical rigor, its geometric proofs, its axiomatic approach. But where did Greek mathematicians get their problems to work on? Many came from Babylon. The Pythagorean theorem, though named after a Greek, was known to Babylonian mathematicians 1,000 years earlier. Greek algebraic techniques for solving equations built on Babylonian methods. And in medicine, Greek physicians like Hippocrates were influenced by Mesopotamian diagnostic traditions. The careful observation of symptoms, the keeping of medical records, the attempt to identify disease patterns, all of this had Mesopotamian precedents. Even Greek mythology shows Mesopotamian influence. The story of Aphrodite and Adonis echoes the Sumerian myth of Inanna and Dumuzi. Greek flood myths parallel Gilgamesh. Greek cosmological ideas about primordial chaos and divine ordering of the cosmos reflect Enuma Elish. These weren't crude borrowings, they were cultural exchanges, mediated through centuries of contact, trade, and intellectual dialogue. The Near East in the first millennium BCE was a cosmopolitan world where ideas circulated, mixed, and transformed, and Mesopotamia, though politically declining, remained intellectually vital, a source of ancient knowledge that others sought out and valued. But there were limits to what could be transmitted. Some knowledge was too embedded in its cultural context to translate easily. The complex omen series, which made sense within Mesopotamian divination practices, were less useful to Greek rationalists who didn't share the underlying assumptions. The literary texts, dependent on Sumerian and Akkadian linguistic nuances, lost much in translation. The religious rituals tied to specific temples and deities couldn't simply be exported to new contexts, and some knowledge was guarded. The Mesopotamian priests knew that certain techniques and information were professional secrets. Not everything was written down fully. Some methods were taught only to trusted students. This created a problem when the institutional framework began to collapse. If the chain of oral transmission broke, if the teacher died before passing on complete knowledge, that knowledge died too. By the Parthian period, in the last centuries BCE, cuneiform was clearly in decline. Aramaic alphabetic script was easier to learn and write, better suited to everyday administration. Cuneiform survived mainly in the conservative temple contexts, used for traditional rituals and astronomical observations. But the pool of people who could read it was shrinking. The last dated cuneiform tablet, from 75 CE, is an astronomical text from Babylon. After that, nothing. The script that had been in continuous use for over 3,000 years finally died. The libraries fell silent. The tablets became artifacts, waiting in the ruins for archaeologists who wouldn't arrive for another 18 centuries. But the broader intellectual tradition didn't completely die. It migrated, transformed, found new expressions. The Jewish community that had been established in Babylon during the exile of 586 BCE continued to thrive under Persian, Seleucid and Parthian rule. The Babylonian Talmud, compiled between the 3rd and 6th centuries CE, shows the continuation of Mesopotamian scholarly traditions. The careful textual analysis, the reverence for ancient wisdom, the assumption that problems can be solved through systematic study and debate. The Talmudic academies in Babylon became major centers of Jewish learning, eventually rivaling and in some ways surpassing the academies in Palestine. The Babylonian Talmud became the more authoritative text in Jewish tradition, studied and debated, up to the present day. In this sense, the scribal culture of ancient Mesopotamia found a new expression, adapted to new content, but preserving the essential approach to knowledge and tradition. Similarly, when the Sasanian Persian Empire established its capital at Ctesiphon, near ancient Babylon, it consciously drew on Mesopotamian administrative traditions. The Sasanian bureaucracy used Pahlavi script rather than cuneiform, but it inherited the Mesopotamian model of centralized record-keeping, taxation systems and legal administration. The empire supported scholarship, maintaining libraries and sponsoring translations of texts from various languages. And when the Islamic conquest came in the 7th century CE, This intellectual infrastructure didn't disappear, it was absorbed. The Abbasid Caliphate, which established its capital at Baghdad in 762 CE, created the House of Wisdom and other scholarly institutions that deliberately sought out ancient knowledge. Greek texts were translated into Arabic, Persian works were copied and studied, and whatever remnants of Mesopotamian learning still existed in isolated libraries or oral traditions were incorporated into the new synthesis. The Islamic Golden Age, in many ways, represented the culmination of a process that had begun in Mesopotamia thousands of years earlier. The systematic collection of knowledge, the translation between languages and cultures, the synthesis of different intellectual traditions, the creation of institutions dedicated to preserving and transmitting learning. These were all Mesopotamian innovations, now finding new expression in an Islamic context. Al-Khwarizmi, the 9th century mathematician whose work gave us the word algorithm, was building on a mathematical tradition that included Greek geometry, Indian numerals, and ultimately Mesopotamian base 60 calculations that still appear in our measurement of time and angles. When he developed algebraic techniques for solving equations, he was advancing a program that Babylonian mathematicians had begun 2,000 years earlier. The astronomers of the Islamic Golden Age, who made precise observations and created detailed astronomical tables, were continuing the work of the Babylonian priests, who had watched the sky for centuries. The medical scholars who systematically collected symptoms and treatments were following in the tradition of Mesopotamian diagnostic texts. None of this was direct continuation. The chain had been broken, then reconnected through multiple intermediaries. But the DNA of Mesopotamian intellectual culture was still there, mutated and recombined but recognizable. In 1849, a young British archaeologist named Austin Henry Layard was excavating the ruins of Nineveh when he uncovered something that would change our understanding of the ancient world. Room after room filled with clay tablets, thousands upon thousands of them, the remnants of Ashurbanipal's great library. Most were broken, many were fragmentary, but they were readable. For the first time in nearly 2,000 years, cuneiform was about to speak again. The decipherment had begun decades earlier. In 1835, Henry Rawlinson, a British army officer stationed in Persia, had begun copying the Behistun inscription, a massive trilingual text carved into a cliff face by the Persian king Darius I. The inscription was in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, providing the key to unlocking cuneiform scripts much as the Rosetta Stone had unlocked Egyptian hieroglyphics. By the time Layard's discoveries reached Europe, scholars could read enough cuneiform to recognize what they had, not just administrative records or royal propaganda, but literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh emerged from the fragments, revealing a sophisticated narrative about mortality, friendship, and the human condition written long before Homer. Creation myths that paralleled Genesis but were demonstrably older, flood stories that predated Noah. The implications were staggering. The Bible, which European scholars had assumed was the oldest written tradition, the original source of ancient wisdom, was suddenly revealed to be part of a much longer continuum. The stories that had been thought to be uniquely divinely inspired were actually drawing on older Mesopotamian narratives, transformed and reinterpreted, but clearly related. This created a crisis in biblical scholarship. If Genesis borrowed from Gilgamesh, if the flood narrative came from Babylonian sources, what did that mean for claims of biblical uniqueness and divine revelation? The debates that erupted in the late 19th century about biblical historicity and interpretation are still ongoing today, but beyond the theological controversies, something more profound was happening, A civilization that had been lost was being recovered. A voice that had been silent for 2 millennia was speaking again, and what it said was both familiar and alien. Familiar because these were humans dealing with universal questions: death and legacy, justice and social order, the relationship between humanity and the divine, the nature of a good life. These themes appear in Gilgamesh as clearly as they appear in Greek tragedy or biblical wisdom literature. The specifics differ, but the fundamental concerns are recognizable. Alien, because the conceptual framework is so different. The Mesopotamian gods aren't omnipotent or perfectly good. They're powerful but capricious, immortal but not infinite, worthy of respect but not necessarily love. They created humans not out of love but out of need, to do the work the gods didn't want to do, and they can destroy humanity on a whim if we become too troublesome. This is a harsher cosmology than the one most modern readers are accustomed to. There's no promise of eternal reward, no guarantee of cosmic justice. The good don't necessarily prosper. The wicked aren't always punished. Life is what you make of it in the brief span you're given, and death ends everything. Yet within this framework, Gilgamesh finds meaning, not through divine salvation, but through human achievement. Build something lasting. Be remembered. Leave a legacy. Your body will die, but your name can live on. This is the closest thing to immortality that mortals can achieve. It's a remarkably modern attitude in some ways, secular, humanistic, focused on tangible achievements rather than spiritual salvation, and it came from a culture 4,000 years old. But as more tablets were translated, a more complex picture emerged. The Mesopotamians weren't simply fatalistic materialists. They had elaborate afterlife beliefs, rituals for the dead, concepts of divine judgment. The picture was more nuanced than early translations suggested, and the more scholars studied the texts, the more they realized how sophisticated Mesopotamian thought had been. The mathematical tablets revealed advanced techniques. The astronomical observations showed systematic data collection spanning centuries. The legal texts demonstrated complex reasoning about justice, liability, and social obligation. The medical texts showed empirical observation and pattern recognition. This wasn't a primitive civilization. This was a mature intellectual culture that had been developing for thousands of years before its legacy was violently interrupted. The tragedy is how much was lost before Layard and others began their excavations. For 18 centuries, the tells of Mesopotamia had been treated as quarries for building materials. Locals had been digging up ancient bricks to reuse in modern construction. Countless tablets had been destroyed or dispersed, libraries had been scattered, context had been lost, and the excavation techniques of the 19th century, by modern standards, were destructive. Archaeologists were looking for museum-quality artifacts, statues, jewelry, impressive tablets. They dug quickly, keeping what looked important and discarding the rest. Stratigraphic context, which modern archaeology recognizes as crucial for understanding chronology and use patterns, was often ignored. Many of the tablets that reached European museums had no documentation about where they were found or in what context. A tablet from Ashurbanipal's library might be catalogued next to one from a completely different period and location, making it difficult for scholars to reconstruct the original collections. And there was another problem. The tablets that were excavated represented a tiny, potentially biased sample of what originally existed. Large, impressive tablets were more likely to be kept. Small fragments were often discarded. Routine administrative documents were considered less interesting than literary works. The result is that our picture of Mesopotamian civilization is skewed toward the exceptional rather than the typical. We have the Epic of Gilgamesh, but we're missing countless other literary works that must have existed. We have Hammurabi's laws, but we're missing most of the actual court cases that would show how those laws were applied. We have astronomical observations from specific periods, but there are centuries-long gaps in the record. We have school exercises, but we're missing the teachers' manuals that would explain their pedagogical methods. Every translation, every new tablet published, fills in tiny pieces of a vast puzzle. But the puzzle is fragmentary. We're looking at a civilization through a keyhole, catching glimpses of its complexity, but never seeing the whole picture. And yet, even those glimpses are remarkable. Consider the flood tablet, discovered by George Smith in 1872, among the fragments from Ashurbanipal's library. Smith was cataloguing tablets in the British Museum when he came across a section describing a great flood and a man who survived by building a boat. He realized he was reading the Mesopotamian version of Noah's flood, and it predated the biblical version by over 1,000 years. Smith became so excited that, according to witnesses, he began running around the room shouting and eventually started removing his clothes in his agitation. This story is probably apocryphal or exaggerated, but it captures something real about the emotional impact of these discoveries. They weren't just academic findings, they were revelations that challenged fundamental assumptions about the origins of Western civilization. The decipherment of cuneiform and the recovery of Mesopotamian literature ranks as one of the great intellectual achievements of the 19th century. It expanded human knowledge of the past by thousands of years. It revealed that civilization was older, more sophisticated, and more widespread than anyone had imagined. But it also revealed something troubling. If a civilization this advanced could be completely forgotten, if knowledge carefully preserved for thousands of years could be lost so thoroughly that its very existence was forgotten, what does that say about the permanence of human achievement? The Mesopotamians had done everything right. They had written things down. They had created institutional structures to preserve knowledge. They had taught generation after generation, maintaining continuity for 3,000 years. And still it was lost. Still it took modern archaeology to recover even fragments of what they knew. This realization has haunted archaeologists and historians ever since. We're not just studying the past, we're studying the loss of the past. We're documenting how civilizations disappear, how knowledge is forgotten, how continuity breaks down, and we're forced to ask, could it happen again? Could our civilization, with all its accumulated knowledge, with all our books and databases and institutional structures, simply disappear? Could future archaeologists be excavating our ruins, trying to piece together what we knew from fragmentary evidence? The answer, uncomfortably, is yes. We've seen it happen in living memory. The destruction of the library in Mosul by ISIS in 2015, the looting of the Baghdad Museum in 2003, the burning of the National Museum of Brazil in 2018. Each of these represented catastrophic losses of knowledge, irreplaceable artifacts destroyed or dispersed, and these were just small-scale disasters. A major civilizational collapse, economic, political, environmental, could break the chains of transmission that preserve our knowledge. Digital storage is particularly vulnerable. If the infrastructure that maintains servers and networks fails, if the knowledge of how to read old file formats is lost, vast amounts of information could become inaccessible within decades. We like to think we're different from the ancients, that our knowledge is more secure, our preservation methods more robust. But the Mesopotamians probably thought the same thing. They had multiple copies of important texts. They had institutional redundancy. They had a cultural commitment to preservation that lasted millennia. And still their knowledge was lost. The only reason we have anything at all from Mesopotamia is the accidental durability of clay tablets. If they had written on papyrus or parchment, like the Egyptians and later civilizations, almost nothing would have survived. The climate of southern Iraq is too wet for organic materials to preserve well. We would have only what was carved in stone, royal inscriptions, law codes, monumental texts, and even those would be fragmentary. It's a sobering thought. The civilization that gave us writing, cities, law, mathematics, astronomy, literature, the foundation of everything we call civilization, survives mainly by accident. And what survives is a tiny fraction of what once existed. This puts the entire archaeological enterprise in a different light. We're not just recovering the past, we're recovering what chance has preserved of the past. And we're in a race against time and entropy, trying to excavate and document before sites are destroyed, before tablets crumble, before context is lost forever. Modern archaeology has become much more careful than the 19th century treasure hunts. Excavations proceed slowly, meticulously documenting every layer, every artifact, every relationship. Digital photography and 3D scanning create permanent records. Tablets are photographed from every angle before being handled. Context is considered as important as the objects themselves. But even with modern techniques, excavation is destruction. Once you dig something up, the original context is gone. You can document it, photograph it, map it, but you can never put it back exactly as it was. Every excavation is a one-time opportunity to observe. Get it wrong, and the information is lost forever. This is why so many archaeological sites remain unexcavated. It's not just lack of funding or political instability, though those are significant factors. It's also a deliberate choice to leave sites for future archaeologists who will have better techniques, better technology, better understanding. We know we're still making mistakes, still missing information. Better to wait than to destroy irreplaceable evidence through premature excavation. But waiting has its own risks. Sites are being looted, they're being damaged by construction and agriculture, they're being destroyed by war. The tells of Mesopotamia that survive for thousands of years are disappearing in our lifetime. There is something haunting about walking through the ruins of Babylon today. The site is there, partially reconstructed by Saddam Hussein in the 1980s, and reconstruction that archaeologists consider both helpful and problematic. Helpful because it gives visitors a sense of scale and grandeur. Problematic because Hussein's builders constructed directly on top of ancient remains, destroying archaeological context in their enthusiasm to glorify Iraq's pre-Islamic past. But even with the reconstructions, the overwhelming impression is absence. Empty courtyards where thousands once gathered, silent streets that once echoed with a dozen languages, crumbling walls that once enclosed the most magnificent city of the ancient world. The hanging gardens, if they existed at all, are gone without trace. The Tower of Babel is a foundation pit filled with groundwater. The great temples are tumbled brick. What remains is a ghost, a shadow of what was. And standing there, you feel the weight of all those centuries pressing down, not just the centuries since Babylon fell, but the centuries when it stood. The accumulated time of human lives lived, decisions made, knowledge gained and lost. The same feeling comes when reading the tablets. You're holding something that someone created 4,000 years ago, a student practicing his writing, a merchant recording a transaction, a priest observing the moon, a poet composing an epic, their hand pressed into this clay, and somehow, impossibly, the mark remains. But you're also aware of all that's missing. For every tablet that survived, dozens or hundreds were destroyed. For every text we can read, there are countless others we'll never know existed. The silence is louder than the speech. This tension between what survives and what's lost, between presence and absence, defines the study of ancient Mesopotamia. We have enough to know that something extraordinary existed, not enough to fully understand it, And the gaps in our knowledge aren't random. They follow predictable patterns. We know more about kings than commoners, more about temples than homes, more about war than daily life, more about men than women, more about cities than countryside. This is partly because of what the ancients chose to preserve. Royal inscriptions were carved in stone, temple rituals were carefully documented, military campaigns were chronicled. These things were considered important enough to record permanently. But it's also because of what survives and what archaeologists have chosen to excavate. Stone monuments survive better than mud brick houses. Urban sites are easier to locate than rural settlements. Male-dominated institutions like palaces and temples left more written records than domestic contexts where women's work happened. The result is a distorted picture. We see Mesopotamian civilization through the lens of its elite institutions. We know what kings and priests thought was important. We know much less about what ordinary people's lives were like. Recent archaeology has tried to correct this bias by focusing on domestic contexts, analysing botanical and faunal remains to understand diet and agriculture, studying skeletal remains to understand health, and lifespan, excavating entire neighbourhoods rather than just monumental structures. But even these efforts are limited by the accidents of preservation. Organic materials decay. Perishable goods leave no trace. Oral traditions that were never written down are lost forever. The vast majority of human experience leaves no archaeological signature. What survives are the durable outliers, stone and clay, metal if it wasn't recycled, occasionally preserved wood or textile in exceptional conditions. This is the material basis from which we try to reconstruct an entire civilization. It's like trying to understand modern society by excavating only government buildings and churches, finding only ceramic dishes and metal tools, with all paper, plastic and electronic devices dissolved away. You'd get some things right, the basic technology level, the broad outlines of social organisation, but you'd miss so much of what made the civilization distinctive. For Mesopotamia, what we're missing is especially tragic because we know they had it. We have catalogue lists from ancient libraries that mention titles we've never found. We have references in surviving texts to other works that are lost. We have teachers' manuals that reference teaching materials we don't have. The gaps are documented. We know what we're missing, even if we can't read it. And sometimes we get tantalizing hints. A fragment of a tablet will preserve a few lines of a poem or historical narrative that's otherwise unknown. Enough to know it existed, not enough to understand it fully. These fragments are precious and frustrating. But perhaps the most profound loss is one we can't even document. The tacit knowledge that was never written down. The craft techniques passed from master to apprentice through demonstration. The musical traditions that existed only in performance. The oral poetry that was recited but never recorded. The folk wisdom, the jokes, the songs, the stories that ordinary people told each other. Every civilization has this oral layer that sits alongside the written record. And for Mesopotamia, that oral layer is completely gone. Vanished without trace, leaving only the formal written texts that were considered important enough to preserve. What was Mesopotamian music like? We have some notations that scholars have tentatively interpreted, but we're not certain. We know they had lyres, harps, drums, and various wind instruments. We have hymns with notations about performance, but we don't know what it sounded like. The living sound is gone. What did Sumerian or Akkadian sound like when spoken? We can reconstruct pronunciation based on writing conventions and comparative linguistics, but it's educated guesswork. No one has heard these languages spoken for 2,000 years. The actual sound, the rhythm, the emotional tone, lost. What jokes did they tell? What stories did mothers tell their children at bedtime? What songs did workers sing in the fields? These things leave no archaeological trace. They're gone as completely as if they never existed. And yet they were real. They were part of the texture of life, probably more important to most people than the grand epics and royal inscriptions that we focus on, because they're what survived. This is the fundamental tragedy of studying the past. Not just that civilizations fall, but that most of what made them alive, the daily experience, the ordinary human moments, vanishes without record. What remains is the skeleton. The living flesh is gone. But there's another way to think about this. The formal record that survives, the tablets, the monuments, the archived texts, represents what the civilization thought was important enough to preserve. These weren't random survivals. They were deliberate choices. The Mesopotamians preserved their literature because they valued it. They copied ancient texts generation after generation because they believed those texts contained important wisdom. They maintained astronomical observations because they thought understanding the heavens was crucial. They kept legal records because they valued justice and wanted precedents available for future cases. What survives is what they chose to fight entropy for, and that tells us something profound about their values, their priorities, their understanding of what mattered. They valued continuity, connection to the past, the transmission of knowledge across generations, the maintenance of tradition even as circumstances changed. These weren't just practical concerns, they were sacred duties, and they succeeded at least partially. The knowledge they fought to preserve did survive, though in fragmentary form. It influenced the civilizations that came after them. It eventually reached us, across 4,000 years, still readable, still meaningful. The Epic of Gilgamesh speaks to us today. The astronomical observations are still useful to modern scholars. The mathematical techniques are still recognizable. The legal principles are still relevant. The basic questions about mortality, justice, social order, and human meaning haven't changed. This is the immortality Gilgamesh sought. Not personal survival, but legacy. The preservation of something meaningful that outlasts the individual. And in this, the Mesopotamians achieved what they set out to do. They built monuments of memory that have outlasted their empire, their language, even their gods. The gods of Mesopotamia are dead. No one worships Marduk or Ishtar anymore. The rituals are forgotten, the temples are ruins, the priesthoods are gone, but the ideas encoded in their myths are still alive, transformed and incorporated into new contexts. The concept of divine law, of justice as a cosmic principle rather than just human convention, survived through its influence on Judaism and Christianity. The 7-day week, ultimately derived from Mesopotamian astronomy and religious practice, structures time for billions of people. The zodiac, the names of planets, the measurement of circles in 360 degrees. All Mesopotamian heritage so deeply embedded in culture that most people don't know the origin. And beyond these specific transmissions, there's a broader legacy. The idea that civilization requires written records, that knowledge should be systematically preserved and transmitted, that understanding the past helps navigate the future, that human achievement can be permanent even though individual humans are not. These ideas seem natural to us, self-evident, but they had to be invented. And they were invented in Mesopotamia, in the temples and scribal schools where priests and scholars dedicated their lives to fighting against forgetting. We are their heirs, whether we know it or not. The university, the library, the archive, the school, these institutions have Mesopotamian DNA. The idea of a professional class dedicated to preserving and transmitting knowledge across generations begins there. So does the idea of history itself, not just chronicles of recent events, but the systematic attempt to understand the deep past, to connect present to ancient origins, to see human experience as a continuous story stretching back to the beginning of time. The Sumerian king list is one of the earliest examples of this historical consciousness. It traces kingship from its mythical descent from heaven through the flood to contemporary rulers. It's not accurate by modern standards. The early reigns are impossibly long, the chronology is confused, important dynasties are omitted, but it's an attempt at comprehensive history, at creating a narrative that encompasses all of time. This is remarkable. Most cultures have origin stories that describe how the world began. But the king list is trying to do more. It's trying to connect mythical time to historical time, to show an unbroken continuity from the age of gods to the present day. Why? Because the Mesopotamians understood that legitimacy comes from continuity. That present. Authority rests on connection to past authority. That innovations need to be framed as restorations. That nothing can be truly new. It must be anchored in tradition, however distant. This is a conservative impulse in some ways. It resists change, it values antiquity over novelty, but it also creates strong incentives for preservation. If the past legitimates the present, then the past must be carefully maintained. The chain of tradition cannot be allowed to break. And for 3,000 years it didn't break. Through wars, invasions, collapses and reconstructions, the chain held. The scribes kept copying, the priests kept observing, the teachers kept teaching, until finally, inevitably, the chain did break and the knowledge became archaeology. But even in death, even as ruins and fragments, Mesopotamia still teaches, still speaks across the millennia, still reminds us that civilizations are fragile, knowledge is precious, and the fight against forgetting is never finished. There is a question that haunts anyone who studies Mesopotamia deeply enough. Not a question about what they knew or how they lived, but something more fundamental, something that cuts to the heart of what civilization means and what we are. The question is this: are we progressing or remembering? We like to think of human history as a story of progress, from primitive beginnings to sophisticated civilizations, from ignorance to knowledge, from superstition to science, an arrow moving forward, always upward, toward greater understanding and capability. But Mesopotamia complicates this narrative, because when you look at what they achieved, the mathematics, the astronomy, the architecture, the social organization, the literary sophistication, you realize they weren't primitive. They were solving problems at a level of complexity that rivals what we do today, just with different tools and different frameworks. And they appeared suddenly, not gradually evolving from simpler forms, but emerging almost, fully formed with cities, writing, and complex knowledge already in place, as if someone had flipped a switch. The standard explanation is that we're missing the transitional forms, that the evolution happened but left no clear archaeological signature, that the apparent suddenness is an artifact of incomplete evidence. And this is probably true, at least partially. But there's another possibility that the Mesopotamians themselves believed, that they inherited their knowledge from an earlier source, that civilization didn't begin with them. They were continuing something that had been interrupted, recovering and preserving something ancient that had nearly been lost, the Apkallu, the antediluvian sages, the teachers from before the flood. This is how they explained their own sophistication, not as invention but as transmission, not as progress but as recovery. And maybe they were right, not literally. There's no evidence for actual fish beings emerging from the ocean to teach humanity, but metaphorically, perhaps Mesopotamian civilization was built on knowledge preserved from an earlier cultural phase, one that was disrupted by the climate catastrophes at the end of the Ice Age. We know there were significant populations living in areas that are now underwater: the Persian Gulf Basin, the Black Sea, coastal regions around the world. When sea levels rose, those populations had to move, and when they moved, they brought their knowledge with them. If those drowned lands had supported sophisticated settlements, not necessarily cities with writing, but communities with accumulated practical knowledge, established trade networks, specialized crafts, then the rapid rise of Mesopotamian civilization becomes more comprehensible. They weren't starting from zero, they were rebuilding. This is speculation. But it's speculation that takes the Mesopotamians' own testimony seriously rather than dismissing it as myth. They said they were preserving ancient knowledge. They said their wisdom came from before the flood. They structured their entire intellectual culture around this belief. What if they were describing, in mythological language, a real historical process, the preservation and transmission of pre-catastrophe knowledge into the post-catastrophe world? It would explain a lot. The sophistication that appears too early, the sense of recovering rather than inventing, the obsession with preventing knowledge loss, the belief that the ancients were wiser than the moderns. And it would suggest that human civilization is not a simple story of linear progress, but something more complex, a cycle of achievement and loss, preservation and recovery, remembering and forgetting. We're in our own phase of this cycle now. We've achieved things the Mesopotamians couldn't have imagined. We've split the atom, mapped the genome, sent machines to other planets. Our knowledge dwarfs theirs in scale and precision, but we're also losing knowledge. Indigenous languages are dying, taking with them unique ways of understanding the world. Traditional craft techniques are being forgotten as mass production dominates. Analog skills are disappearing in the digital age, and our own knowledge storage systems are surprisingly fragile, more vulnerable in some ways than clay tablets baked in fire. The Mesopotamians would recognize this pattern. Knowledge gained, knowledge lost, the necessity of active preservation, the danger of assuming that what we know will automatically be passed forward. They would tell us that nothing is automatic. That transmission requires institutions, requires teaching, requires a cultural commitment that spans generations. That knowledge not deliberately preserved will be lost, that the chain of memory must be consciously maintained or it will break, and they would tell us that civilizations fall. Not might fall, do fall. It happened to them repeatedly. Akkad collapsed, Ur fell. Babylon was conquered, yet each time something survived, because they had built redundancy into the system. Multiple copies, multiple locations, multiple institutions maintaining the same traditions. This is their final lesson. Not that collapse can be prevented, it probably can't, not forever, but that knowledge can survive collapse if you prepare for it, if you preserve things in durable forms, if you distribute copies widely, if you embed knowledge deeply in cultural practice, if you teach the next generation not just facts, but the commitment to preserve and transmit. The modern world is increasingly centralized and digital. Information exists in fewer physical locations, dependent on complex infrastructure. If that infrastructure fails, if the electrical grid goes down, if the internet fragments, how much of our knowledge would we lose? How quickly would we forget how to access information stored in formats that require specific software and hardware? The Mesopotamians didn't have this problem. Clay tablets don't require electricity. Cuneiform doesn't need special software to read, just knowledge of the script. The medium was resilient, even if the chain of transmission eventually broke. We've traded resilience for capacity. We can store vastly more information in vastly less space, but that information is more vulnerable. A hard drive fails, a server crashes, a file format becomes obsolete, and the information is gone. We have backups, but backups require active maintenance. They require someone to keep copying, upgrading, migrating data to new systems. Which brings us back to the human element. Knowledge doesn't preserve itself. Someone has to care enough to maintain it, to copy the old texts, to update the file formats, to teach the next generation why this matters. The Mesopotamian scribes cared. For 3,000 years they cared, generation after generation, copying tablets that were already ancient, maintaining traditions whose origins were lost in myth, preserving knowledge they didn't fully understand because they believed it was important. That's dedication. That's commitment to something beyond yourself. That's understanding that you're part of a chain stretching back to the beginning of time and forward to an unknowable future, and that your job is to keep the chain intact for one more generation. This is what we've lost, perhaps, this sense of being custodians rather than consumers, of owing a debt to the past and a duty to the future, of seeing knowledge as something sacred that must be protected. The Mesopotamians saw their intellectual tradition as sacred. It had been given to them by the gods through the Apkallu in the time before the flood. It was their responsibility to maintain it, not for personal profit or political power, though it could be used for those things, but because the knowledge itself was precious, because letting it be lost would be a betrayal of their ancestors and their descendants. We need some of that spirit now. Not the specific religious framework. We have our own ways of thinking about knowledge and value, but the underlying commitment, the recognition that what we know is not ours alone, but a collective heritage that we hold in trust. Every time a library closes, every time a university program is cut, every time indigenous knowledge holders die without passing on their traditions, every time we allow short-term economic pressures to override long-term cultural preservation, we're breaking the chain. We're letting something irreplaceable be lost. The Mesopotamians would understand. They lived through these losses repeatedly. They knew what it felt like to see knowledge disappear, traditions broken, continuity interrupted. And they kept fighting to preserve what they could, even when the world was falling apart around them. That last cuneiform tablet from 75 CE, an astronomical observation, recorded in a dying script by a priest who probably knew he was one of the last people who could still write it. That's dedication, that's courage. Maintaining the tradition even as it was ending, leaving a final record for whoever might someday care enough to look, and someone did care. 18 centuries later, archaeologists dug it up, scholars deciphered it. The observation was checked against modern calculations and found to be accurate. That anonymous priest's final act of preservation succeeded. The knowledge survived the death of the civilization that created it. This is what we're trying to do with all our archives and libraries and museums. We're creating time capsules for the future. We're leaving records of what we knew, what we achieved, what we thought was important, hoping that someone, someday, will find them and understand. But we're also part of a living tradition. Unlike the Mesopotamian scribes, we haven't lost the chain yet. We can still read the texts of previous generations. We still have institutional continuity. The universities, the research institutions, the libraries, these are the direct descendants of the Mesopotamian scribal schools, transformed and evolved but serving the same essential function, preserving knowledge, transmitting it across generations, training the next generation of knowledge keepers, fighting against entropy and forgetting. This is the real legacy of Mesopotamia, not the specific discoveries they made, though those are impressive, not the cities they built, though those were magnificent, but the commitment to preservation, the understanding that knowledge is precious and fragile, the institutional frameworks for maintaining cultural memory across deep time. They were the first civilization to think this way, the first to write things down systematically, the first to create schools and libraries, the first to copy ancient texts because the texts themselves were valuable, regardless of immediate utility, the first to see themselves as part of a chain of memory stretching back thousands of years. And in the end, they succeeded. The civilization fell. The cities crumbled. The language died, the gods were forgotten, but the knowledge survived, at least partially, transformed, translated, incorporated into new contexts, but alive, still meaningful, still speaking to us across 4,000 years. When you read the Epic of Gilgamesh today, you're participating in an act of cultural transmission that spans millennia. You're part of a chain that includes the original poet who composed it, the scribes who copied it, the priests who preserved it, the archaeologists who excavated it, the scholars who translated it, and all the readers who have kept it alive in human memory. That chain was broken for 18 centuries, but it reconnected. The knowledge that was lost was found again, and that's the hope, that even if the chain breaks, even if knowledge is lost, it might be recovered, that the clay tablets baked in fire will outlast empires waiting in the ground for someone who cares enough to dig them up and read them. We are Mesopotamia's heirs. We inherited their script, their mathematics, their astronomy, their literary forms, their legal concepts, their institutional models. But more than any specific knowledge, we inherited their project, the project of civilization itself, understood as the deliberate preservation and transmission of accumulated knowledge across generations. This is what connects us to those ancient scribes. This is what makes studying Mesopotamia more than just antiquarian curiosity. We're looking at the beginning of something we're still part of, the beginning of the human attempt to overcome mortality, not through personal survival, but through cultural continuity, through building something that lasts beyond individual lives. Gilgamesh learned this lesson. After his failed quest for immortality, he returned to Uruk and saw his walls, his city, his legacy in stone. This would survive him. This would remember him. And it did. Gilgamesh died 4,000 years ago, but his name lives on. His story is still told. His questions about mortality and meaning still resonate. He achieved the only immortality available to humans, not eternal life, but enduring memory. And Mesopotamian civilization achieved the same thing. The cities are gone, but the memory remains. The civilization died, but its legacy lives on in every library, every school, every archive that preserves knowledge for future generations. This is the final revelation. Mesopotamia didn't fail. It succeeded in exactly what it set out to do. It preserved its knowledge. It transmitted its wisdom. It built monuments of memory that outlasted empire. And it reminds us that we're not separate from the past. We're continuous with it. The same project, the same struggle, the same commitment to preservation that drove those ancient scribes drives us now. We're all fighting against forgetting, all trying to leave something meaningful behind, all hoping that someone, someday, will find what we preserved and understand why it mattered. The rivers still flow, the Tigris and Euphrates, older than civilization, watching the rise and fall of empires with the same indifferent continuity. The land between the rivers, where it all began, where humans first became more than just another animal, where we became custodians of knowledge, builders of memory, preservers of the past for the sake of the future. That's Mesopotamia's gift to us. Not just specific knowledge, but the understanding that knowledge must be preserved. That civilization is not automatic, but achieved through deliberate effort across generations. That the chain of memory must be consciously maintained or it will break, and the understanding that even when it breaks, even when civilizations fall and knowledge is lost, recovery is possible. That what was forgotten can be remembered, that the past speaks if we listen carefully enough, that clay tablets baked in fire can wait 4,000 years and still tell their story to anyone who takes the time to read them. This is what endures. Not power or wealth or empire, but knowledge, memory, story. The human voice speaking across the centuries saying, "We were here. We learned things. We built things. We discovered things. Remember us. Learn from us. continue what we started. And we do. We remember, we learn, we continue. The rivers of eternity flow on.